Hallo, ik begrijp Nederlands, maar ik kan het niet zo goed. Ik kan niet zo goed Nederlands spreken. Je snapt dat. Je kan dat zien. I will go further in English, of course. And I also have to just set up some slides that I brought to show you. I moved 3 years ago, actually, to now live in Amsterdam from New York, where I had been based. You need to hear it a little bit better? Okay. I had been based in New York for 15 years, where I was working as an artist. I had a studio in Brooklyn. And before that, actually, I was a student in the mountains in America, the Berkshire Mountains, where there was one street. It was called Main Street. And we used to sort of think of ourselves like cows sort of strolling across the campus, the grassy campus, slowly looking at things, thinking about a theory course, thinking about religion, thinking about politics, protesting against racism on the campus. We were just having our minds so full, but our bodies, in some way, we could kind of walk around very slowly, and that's something I really enjoyed being a student on a campus. When I got to New York, I felt like that same strolling cow, and that I would kind of, do this, slowly walking down the street when I got there, looking at everything, and, there's this going on, and the city is moving so fast, and you're in the way of all the people who are very, very busy. And after being there for 15 years, I slowly got into that stream of busyness, and production and daily life became this different kind of pace. But this idea of being slow and taking time to think about something, and certainly taking time to be present. I talk a lot about in my work, a kind of driving spirit in my work is asking people to pause for a moment, to take a moment out of our daily life to connect with our surroundings, or to perhaps engage with an idea or an emotion a little bit more deeply, to participate in something or to connect with someone. It's that moment, where you stop and you see something or you feel it. That's a driving principle in my work, but let me show you some examples of that. Okay, here we go. This is the street outside my studio in Brooklyn. My studio was over here, but this to me is just an example of what I'm talking about, something that you see that is unusual, that stops you in your tracks. And my walk from the subway to my studio, my head was always filled with the day's to-do list, the things that I wanted to do, the people I had to meet at the studio. And I love these moments so much, something that would stop me and I would pause and think about it. And this was something else that I encountered on my way to the studio. I don't know if you can read what that truck says. Municipal solid waste. That means that there's a big truck full of shit sitting on my street. And that was also another thing of like, what is really here? What's in my surroundings? Why is there a loaded truck parked outside the studio? Yeah, it's odd. This is something else. This was not in the studio building, but this was in my apartment building. Here's the detail. There was a Post-it note in the elevator. And I love that. It made me question, did someone just get in an argument in the building? Were they saying, I love you too? Is there an affair going on between one floor and another? It was very exciting to think about. And this is a little project I did with some young students recently, where we walked around with our own box of Post-it notes, drawing people's attention to things that they saw that they thought were interesting. Can you all read that, I think? Yeah. Oh ja. Deze streepjes lijken op eetstokjes. The child thought that they looked like Chinese chopsticks, yeah. What is the English word? And then something a bit heavier, perhaps. This is a work that I just learned about from someone who lives in Hilversum. This is called a stumbling block project. I don't know if you can see them down at the bottom about here. But there's a German artist who has apparently taken, since the late 90s, a project on very personally to himself. His name is Günther Demnig, and he is making memorials to the Holocaust, and wherever he has made research about someone who was taken away, he's made small, I would say, memorials to the point of departure where they were taken. And I love the name of a stumbling block. It's, I love this idea that we stumble over, we bump into. There's a Post-it note in the elevator. These kind of moments are just so beautiful, in my opinion, and also, yeah, potentially life-changing. So my work, this here is one of my pieces. It's a chalk shoe that I did very early on when I was in New York. Here you can see a photograph of them. I brought one here in on the table for you to see as well. This is a fleet of the chalk shoes. And the first project I did actually had a Dutch title. It was called Kalk. Do I say that well? Or it's like stoepkrijt. And there was an area I learned, I was working, I had a part-time job in an architect's office, and I was helping him organize his books. And I realized that looking at old maps of New York, that there used to be a freshwater pond, lo and behold, in Lower Manhattan, which was just unbelievable for me to think about, because down there you have family courthouses, some of the main courthouses, you've got, yeah, street vendors, bankers, Wall Street, etc. And it was very difficult for me to try to transform this very hectic, busy landscape into this bucolic setting. And here you see an etching from that period. And the Dutch settlers, when they came, they realized actually that this beautiful pond, and this is the reason it has the name, Kalkhoek, it shimmered because Native Americans had been using this pond and eating oysters out of the pond and actually burying those oysters in very careful kind of recycling bins under the ground. You know, they just dug holes and put the oyster shells in there. And then from years of walking around the perimeter of that pond, it crunched up the oyster shells, and the perimeter of the pond actually shimmered. It glistened. And the Dutch called it Kalkhoek, and later it became Collect Pond. And later, after using it for not only leisure activities, but also for early tanneries and early businesses, and for very unsophisticated plumbing of the early settlers, it became so polluted that historians wrote about it that if you would walk in the vicinity of this park, you would become immediately ill. So they did what anyone might expect. They buried the pond. They got rid of the problem. I'm making a joke, but it was interesting to think about that they got rid of this freshwater pond. It was not fresh anymore, and they buried it. And so now actually there is a collapsing area in front of one of the courthouses where the watery landscape is sort of coming back. And there's a terrible park sign that stands up that says Collect Pond Park, and it's a very sort of sad thing with maybe 2 or 3 benches. So this was very inspiring to me to think about this history under our feet. And this, you will see the overlaid maps of the Collect Pond. It was in the early 1800s when they buried it, by the way. And this is my project. These are the chalk stripes from the shoes with 11 performers. It took about an hour to trace the perimeter of the freshwater pond. This was the performer. And so we did that, and we made that visible, the old perimeter of Collect Pond Park visible to them, and handed out actually information to people, because we would hold up traffic. People were honking at us. These shoes, you can, if you'd like later, you can come and feel them. They're very heavy, and the way they work actually is by dragging your feet. And so they make the chalk line and you drag them. And some people encountered us for only 3 seconds, and other people actually followed the performers, some almost for the entire hour in this kind of slow procession to mark the pond. And then since that time, I've actually been invited to do other chalk shoe projects. I will show you a couple, but you might be interested just to see how the chalk shoe is made. This is the casting mold. This is also what the shoe looks like after an hour performance. So they become, I think, very interesting artifacts of the performative act. This one particular chalk shoe performance I would like to talk to you about, I did for around the occasion of the New Orleans biennial that was to mark after the Hurricane Katrina, to bring people through the arts into the city, to continue to bring attention to the plight of the people in that area. And one place in particular that was on the map was a school that had about 500 students who were missing since 2005. And here you see is a chalkboard in that school, which was destroyed by the hurricane, by the flooding in the lower Ninth Ward. And they had maintained still what was still surviving. It says, "Have a safe weekend," in the upper left corner, a message from the teacher to the students. And that was just the weekend before the hurricane struck. And so some of the students are missing. Some were sent to other cities to live. This is the exterior where you see the kind of flooding and mold and destruction. It's so strong with that "You Are Beautiful" sign above it, I think. And this is the project that I did with some students who were still there, to come and kind of create a performative game around the school building and linking the art center of the city to this school, drawing a kind of a thread between the two spaces. I researched the history of hopscotch, and this project is called Hopscotch for New Orleans. And the game was begun when the kids, here they are in front of the school, threw a red puff filled with crushed red chalk. And then from there, they would start to make these circles. And actually, it is one of the earliest forms of the hopscotch game, actually by the French, was played by the French, and funny enough, called escargot. But I thought they began to look a bit sort of like wild weather patterns, like the hurricane. And as we walked through the neighborhoods, we would connect with different people who were living, and they would come out of their yards and talk with us and tell us their experience, talk to us about troubles with their children, that the health of their children was suffering since the hurricane because some of the chemicals that came out and got into their soil in front of their house are very troubling for the health of their children. And then there were other things that I did, because in New Orleans there's a wonderful history of processional performances. And so it's like the walking jazz band. And so we hired some musicians to come and work together. Some of them were parents of the children who were then on stilts going through this hopscotch game. I think you can see them in the upper corner. And they sort of came along behind. So made it more of a festive affair. And this is the last project I thought to talk to you about before Sarah and I sit down. This is a similar kind of form, a spiral form, but a very different kind of project. This is called reflejar in Spanish, meaning to reflect in English. And I created this project on a residency in Mexico, in a mountainous area in Mexico called Moravatio. And it was a residency for ecology and the environment. And I created this project after studying with some women about their types of embroidery. And although I haven't showed you a lot of my work, maybe you've seen on the website, working with fabric and embroidery is something really close to me. I was raised by my grandmother, who is a fashion designer. And so I grew up kind of hanging around her sewing school. And so working with thread, and I'm always very attuned to when I see other women working with thread or working with their hands. And in Mexico, in this particular city, anywhere you would go, if you would go and buy bread, if you would buy bananas, there was always someone in the very near area, vicinity, working with their hands and with thread and embroidery. So I had them teach me something called the sun stitch, which was a traditional stitch for them. And I invited them to do a project where we embroidered into the ground to have a day to talk about problems that they're having in the environment, to have a kind of reflective moment together. They had an infestation of spiders. These are actually our own spider webs, as you will. But it was getting too dry in this area. And there is this notion that, I think it's called the Albedo Effect, that as the reflectivity of our Earth decreases with the melting of the snow caps, that we need to create new ways to reflect the sun back upwards. So you maybe have heard before in the news how people talk about painting our rooftops white, for example. So we had a bit of a discussion of saying, oh, well, maybe we could embroider all these nets and we can reflect the sun. I'm going to pause there. Thank you.